uh, another episode of Software Cooperatives podcast. Um, Today we're going to talk about enabling worker co-ops. Um, I think today's discussion was inspired from a video posted on Democracy at Work titled "Enabling Worker Co-ops." And so we've got a pretty cool mind map here made by Watson, and we're just going to dive in. So, yeah, let's do it. Watson, you want to take us away to give us
Sure.
an intro to your mind map?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and it's just to help people follow along. A couple of us has watched the video, and we just want to dissect it and think a little bit about Richard Wolff, who is an economist at the University of Massachusetts, and who is really influential with talking about cooperatives and worker-owned structures, and then also a co-founder of Lumio, which is a tool we use, and also of a cooperative named Richard Bartlett. So what we're going to do, I guess, and then if anyone wants to, interject with notes or whatever, feel free. But I was just going to go through the second part of the video and just really talk about, or try to talk about, Spiral, Lumio, collective decision making. They were really excited about the Occupy movement, learned some things there. And then hierarchy, which is a recurring theme with talking about cooperatives. So the first thing, I think they introduced Lumio and said, hey, this is a great thing for helping decision making. Lumio is an open source tool. You can look at it as another form of activism. It grew out of the Occupy movement. We can get into that later. It's named after a weaving tool. And Richard Wolff thought that Lumio was really served an interesting purpose, or important purpose, because he found that in the organizations that he's been a part of, the people that aren't heard, they leave the organization. And I think that in my personal experience, that's the same thing. People that don't participate, they might not have that strong personality or what have you. They tend to shy away, and when they get a better opportunity somewhere else, then they leave. So it's really important to try to get people involved. So there's a little bit of there's two separate entities. There's Lumio, and then there's Spiral. And Spiral is another entity, and that's really the cooperative. Lumio is a product. Okay. So within Spiral, there's all types. The cooperative. There's all types of social commitments and activities that they want to do. So they want to pursue radical social change. They are described. He described, or Richard Bartlett described, in Spiral as a decentralized network of people. Okay, they are interested in, and Richard Bartlett is interested in collaborative government, self-management, and co-ownership. Okay, his background is that he's an engineer, and within Spiral, and also on the work of Lumio, creating Lumio, he serves in a coordinator role, which I think is an important thing for us to probably try to talk about. So the coordinator role is interesting because when you have this group, and we're going to talk about it in a little bit, where you do these circles, you have a group where people are forming their ideas. And every time they form the idea, you might need a little management, and that coordinator role kind of adjusts the proposal. And I've got some things I probably want to come back to when I'm talking about that. But this, instead of it being a weakness where people might think, oh, we're revisiting this too much, he says that that's actually part of the strength, because you increase the quality of the proposal or proposals, right? So it's a summarizing role, and then he, and I talk about inputs over here on the bottom left-hand side of it, but he accounts for inputs like saying, okay, there might be people who are experts in certain fields, the right people, he called them, maybe giving them a little bit more weight. So this is an interesting role. You guys have anything to add to this so far?
Not for this part. No.
Okay. All right. So let's go. Let's talk a little bit about the process. And there was a general description, though, about Lumio. Richard Bartlett called it another kind of activism. He himself, he was an activist, and it started back in 2011, and he became involved with something within Occupy, and he kind of changed that over into trying to make it to where he facilitates things like Occupy, and then that's where Lumio comes in. And just a general overview of Lumio. There's a process, and in real life, there's a process, and the Lumio kind of facilitates that process. There's some, and you'll have some type of group. It's not like open. The decision-making process is not open to everyone in the world. There's some limit. So it could be a city. It could be, some citizens. It could be the people within a company, whatever. So you decide on the membership, right? Then you create a meeting room in real life. That's kind of what you would do. And it's for discussion. In Lumio, it's kind of this discussion like folder or area. And then you get inputs from the right people. And then you do this in such a way to where you refine proposals, and then you vote. And you vote either abstaining, agreeing, disagreeing, or blocking. So that's what that's all about. I think so. There was a big part of the talk that was about the Occupy movement and collective decision making. Of the first part, he's describing. Richard Bartlett was describing his first encounter with what he called circle sitting. Circle sitting was when he was doing this activism. Was where you actually literally sat in a circle and you tried to build consensus on what you were going to do. And he says it's a better way to organize because it benefits from collective intelligence. And he said it was his first time being in a situation where there was no teacher, there's no hierarchy. Now, the drawbacks to circle sitting was that it lasted for hours, and it was devastating to morale of the people, because he said it was lasting literally like 6 hours sitting in a circle. So that's the issue. And then that's how Lumio kind of grew out of his encounter with this circle sitting. And then he goes on to describe a little bit more about Occupy, but do you guys have anything about that portion or anything that I was saying earlier?
I know Lucina had some comments at one point about the updates on the decision making. That's a proposal.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you had any of those thoughts you want to share right now, Lucina. The one thing that I was thinking about was the iterative, which kind of ties in with the capability of when you were mentioning blocking and some of those. But even my understanding was even if it was rejected, you may need the discussion could continue, but it was about allowing people to disagree and then but coming to a decision. And then if there was something that's remaining that needs to be discussed, then you could bring that back up. But that way you would go through an iterative process and your decisions would get closer and closer to what the group wants. I found that interesting, where sometimes something will get closed off and shelved and it wasn't discussed. It gets shelved, but then it comes back up and the issue wasn't addressed, so then it comes back. And I don't know. I'd like to look more into that myself. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah, I found this interesting, this whole role, and then the iterative process, and then the facilitator. So I definitely want to come back to that. Anything else from you guys? Okay. All right, let's describe this Occupy movement, because I haven't really done, I have not done a whole lot of studying of the Occupy movement, first person experiences and stuff like that. Now, Richard Bartlett said that the Occupy movement was, half of it was crushed by the government. The other half was crushed by consensus, which is what made him think about or work on Lumio, this consensus problem with the circle sitting, right? And then, Richard Wolff kind of talks about the common notion of what people think of Occupy, something that grew and then died really quickly, right? And so part of this talk is about saying what came out of the Occupy movement, and according to Richard Bartlett, the things that were lasting from it that we still have with us today, Lumio being one. Is part of the argument. I want to come back to Taiwan, as they kind of talked about that at the end. Yeah, and just a little bit of recap. When he was talking about normally people with no Lumio, they will have discussions, and this is part of the circle sitting. They'll have discussions, and they never come to a decision. So Lumio kind of forces you to come to a decision. So of course you get away from this lasting for hours thing. And so in Lumio, you get to the point to where you submit the proposal at some point. Now, Richard Wolff was preoccupied, really interested in talking about hierarchies, and kind of really tried to press Richard Bartlett on how did he overcome hierarchies, right? And so, let's see here. When Richard Bartlett said, Lumio resists hierarchical structures. You really need to use it in such a way to where, it's a more flat organization. You're not going to have one person that tells other people what to do. And then Wolff was asking him, really, how do you defeat that problem where we've got governments that are hierarchies, you got corporations that are hierarchies? What are you going to do? And Richard his answer was, it's really the social movements that are going to combat the hierarchies, right? So what he's doing, again, with another kind of activism, he's going to facilitate the social movements, rely on the social movements, and then grow alternative forms of governments, which when we come over here and describe, say, the situation that happened in Taiwan, that would be an alternative form of government. So with Taiwan, there was, I've never heard of any of this. So Taiwan, there was an Occupy situation where Taiwan, and I have my other notes here, so I'm going to go off those a little bit, but they had a situation where Taiwan said, oh yeah, the economy is really complicated. Go ahead and trust us. And then there was some resistance to that. And so there was some, you might call them hackers, just, social activists that were technology based, that went ahead and made an alternative government site that kind of showed the budget in a more clear fashion. That's kind of a very personal thing for me, because I've worked on budget systems, and I know that government orgs actually really do on purpose make the budget complicated. So I was really interested in that. But they worked on an alternative form of the budget system, and allowed regular people to citizens to look at it and understand it a little bit better. And then some other things grew out of that, where there was an Occupy movement where people decided they went ahead and strategically picked a certain a certain part of the government, the part that was like the Ministry of Transportation or something, and said, okay, these are people that we're going to be able to influence. And what they did was they went and occupied that legislature, and inside of, I guess, inside of the building and outside of the building, and they kind of had these open discussions where they did their circle sitting, all this type of stuff, but they recorded it live, so they were also facilitated by the tech. And so it's kind of, we can really see that people were participating and have more influence that way. So he said that there were thousands of people deliberating over the decisions, and they picked something simple, like how we're going to manage Uber, okay, in Taiwan. All right, they went and did that. They came through their circle sitting. They came up with 7 or 8 policy points, and they went ahead and passed those policy points, and the government stamped them, passed off on them. So that is the whole thing with doing with Taiwan. That's what I think was the gist of the importance of the whole talk. So do you guys have anything else? Any comments?
Mainly that whole movement sounds really interesting, and I think he was saying it was that started the movement. I think it was the Sunflower Student Movement, which I posted here, and then they've kicked off and continued out to non-technical policies. And yeah, it sounds very inspiring, affecting the government. I definitely want to read more on that.
Yeah.
So I have 2 comments or 2 points of note. I really liked when Richard Wolff was like, "So, Richard Bartlett, how are you going to solve the problem of hierarchies across the world?" I was like, wow, that's a big problem. And Richard Bartlett was like, well, it starts with small change. So they'll just provide this service and provide this tool to facilitate smaller groups getting together and making changes. And I've seen the same thing in software. There can be like one little product group that decides to do a different process. And if it works for them, then other groups will say, hey, they're onto something. And then it will adopt and get bigger and expand over time. So I thought that was pretty cool how he was like, well, we're not going to change the world overnight, but we can be one little resource that kind of helps with the social transformation. And then the second part of the interview that really made me giggle a little bit was when after Richard Bartlett was describing the process and talking about how you go into this virtual meeting room and you asynchronously you give your input, and you can asynchronously go round robin and have a discussion and then decide on an action item. And Richard Wolff asked, well, have you tried it? And at first I was like, what is he talking about? Because I take Lumio for granted. I think when I started with the group 2 years ago, we were already using it. So I definitely took it for granted that this was just a common using. And for him to ask, have you even tried it, just felt like, yeah. And then, but it could be, people build tools and maybe they don't use them for themselves. They build tools for other people and never eat your own dog food, so to speak.
Yeah, that is definitely the case. People oftentimes do not eat their own dog food, so we got to check that. And I kind of just assumed that they used it, but yeah, you're right. It was kind of funny. He kind of almost responded in such a way to where it was, yeah, that's almost like a silly question, but yeah, this was good. I thought this was a good thing. We need more people talking about cooperatives, worker-owned things, entities, structures, all that stuff. My thing here that I wanted to come back to with this coordinator role. Okay, so, and you may have heard some of the language that Bartlett was saying, like he doesn't like voting, like that whole idea of voting. And I've heard that also from other people, the bossless society people, like talking about, oh, I don't like voting. There is something that that concerns me when you have somebody that creates the options. They call it slating within like the voting game theory. The people that create the options. So, for instance, in real life, an example would be the primaries for voting in the United States. The people that create the options, they have all the power. That's how you hack that system. So this here is susceptible to slating. Right. So that's just something to keep in mind. So this is where I would expect the game to start for this for a setup for the proposals. But if everybody knows that, then it might, maybe that could change, but I don't know. But slating is something to keep in mind. Does anybody else have anything? All right.
Going back to the decision tools, at the time of this interview, it seemed that there was only one way to, well, I think it is called voting on a proposal right now. And it was this agree, abstain, disagree, and block. I think they have added some new features since then, because there's a new block on the proposal page, and there's different decision tools that apparently you can use. There's one, the proposal that we know, and there's one called check, and there's only 2 responses, tick or dash. So I'm not quite sure use that. And there's also a poll, so you could give several options and then get a poll on what choice is the preferred one. Looks like they also have dot voting now. Now I'm not sure if this dot voting would be similar to how we've been using Google Forms, in that it's kind of secret ballot. So they, people can only see what they are doing on their computer, and then at the end it's all visible for everybody else. And then there's a time poll. So similar to the Google form that we just sent out about what time you'd prefer to have your daily stand-up, it looks like I could have done that through Lumio. So that's kind of cool that they have these new features and ways to get everyone's input.